Welcome to this week's episode, April 27th, episode number 6 of C12. Our sponsor this week is Imagine K12. Imagine K12, the Silicon Valley incubator for edtech companies, will start its summer 2012 program in July. The online application is currently open and is due May 4th, so right around the corner. First segment of C12 today, in April 27th. I wanted to talk first about Dreambox. And Dreambox is actually a very cool little application. It's adaptive learning for math, so really a response to intervention. Which is excellent. They had been selling though to parents and to teachers and schools. They've now repositioned themselves though to really be selling directly to schools and focus on that piece of their business. Probably makes sense. Parents' understanding of adaptive learning is perhaps not what it should be, and I think they'll probably find as a number of the other RTI applications have a bit more luck, really focusing on the school market. Selling to schools, though, as we know, is actually a remarkably challenging thing, with very long lead cycles and overall not always easy. So best to keep all of their focus where it needs to be. So they actually raised an additional $11 million late last year, and should be kind of the effects of that. So that's according to GeekWire, and an interesting story about an interesting application. The next story comes from the Wall Street Journal, and this is there are two related stories here. The first is actually the one that caught my eye as a follow-up on another topic they had run, and it is the question is what's wrong with education in the United States, and what they came to is that there were a whole lot of people who were pretty irritated by an article they wrote earlier this week on the slowdown in American education. And their opening line was, throughout American history, almost every generation has had substantially more education than that of its parents. That is no longer true, and that is that certainly struck a chord with a lot of folks. I think people who didn't want to consider that, didn't like to believe it, and didn't like the sort of in-your-face, our educational system is failing our students message. And but they go on to cite some pretty troubling statistics. Development already has broad ramifications across the U.S. job market, they say. Those with only a high school diploma had an 8% unemployment rate in March, roughly double that of college graduates, who had a 4.2% unemployment rate. And noting that those with college degrees had significantly higher incomes. We knew all this, but what they're saying is because there aren't people pursuing long-term college education, aren't pursuing really relevant college education, perhaps, people who can't even afford it, or who are actually, we're seeing increases in dropouts across the country here in the United States. So what we are left with is a whole bunch of people who are not as capable as their baby boomer parents of going out and achieving reasonable income and contributing to the advancement of our society. Definitely struck a chord, and if we look at the responses to it, really it was it was definitely striking for a lot of folks. A gentleman named Andrew Black wrote back and said, quality and usefulness of education is being ignored here. It isn't a fact that more education means better jobs or better workforce. Too many kids are majoring in sociology, women's studies, and other useless fields of study that do not equate to any measurable economic benefit. Which leads to a whole lot of questions. There are those who believe, myself among them, that going to college and learning to learn and becoming a lifelong learner is probably of more value than what specific field you enter, unless you are really focused on science, technology, engineering type fields. But interestingly, if we see this sort of general level of education, and we look at what our parents and their parents studied in college, many of them were preparing for the space race. Many of them were dealing with Cold War issues. Defense was important. Science had seemed more groundbreaking and had more value. So our parents who went to engineering school, who went to, wanted to get advanced degrees in math and various fields that would support these sorts of, Cold War, space race kinds of things, that's no longer an inspiration for kids. And although that's not a problem if it's isolated, we certainly do need computer scientists. We do need people who are really highly educated in very technical fields. Kirsten and I talked yesterday on Ed News Ticker, or a couple days ago on Ed News Ticker, about the University of Florida closing their computer science department. Certainly seems as though that's a sign of the times, and people are sort of turning away from these really high-value degrees. So I think we need a balance. We need a balance of people who can learn and adapt and learn to learn, but we also need these hard skills. And when we don't have students entering those fields because they're either unprepared because of their secondary and their secondary education, or they lack the motivation, we've got a problem, which is why we see technical companies scrambling to get additional visas to bring people from foreign countries where there's a high value placed on technical education. So definitely a issue of concern there, and an interesting take from the Wall Street Journal. Well worth checking out the article. Education Week talks about something that I've railed against for a long time. Kirsten Winkler and I have certainly talked about it. Their title is Accountability Moving Beyond Math and Reading Tests, and state accountability plans are now counting more subjects, which it sounds positive, but what this is really in response to states requesting waivers from NCLB requirements, and these states are all noting that the majority of them, in fact, are saying, we don't want to tie teachers' success, student success, and ability to graduate or move on or get raises or whatever strictly to these STEM fields, which seems in contrast perhaps to the last story, but in fact is really quite a significant concern. Because if there are more than enough students who are quite brilliant, who can do very, very well for themselves in a variety of fields, but their teachers and they are being held back because of this kind of non-stop dogged focus on math and in fact English as their high stakes tests of choice. We look at the Common Core of standards. These standards all, of course, relate to math and to English. There's obviously emerging standards on other subjects, but all these schools are noting that at the very least, aside from math and English, we need to be getting science in there as a subject that we make sure the students are meeting certain requirements for, and kind of makes sense. So knowing that teachers or schools, districts, and states are all looking to get beyond this kind of core of focus on high stakes tests in relatively limited subject areas. Math and English are obviously pretty important, but there's a little more to our education than this, and to ensuring that students are prepared in that way that we were just talking about. Students are prepared for fields in STEM, for research, for a knowledge economy. It doesn't just come from math and English. So another interesting article there out of Education Week, excuse me. Now, talking about a couple of posts in the Washington Post, a couple of articles in the Washington Post, in particular looking at New York State, which is generally considered to be a leader in this kind of test-driven educational reform, and we have now a lot of principals, a very large number of principals in New York who are calling for something that we talked about over the last couple of weeks here on C12 and on Review Ed. They are actually talking about a wrecking ball of reform. It's their words. The wrecking ball meaning, start fresh. Get rid of these old systems and do something better. And really asking that this high stakes testing, same issue, be really rethought. And unfortunately, these tests are so entrenched in what we've done, and we've spent so many, literally billions of dollars developing them nationwide, making sure they're rolled out and used and are working and deployed and analyzed and thought about ad nauseum in schools, and it's time to set them aside and do something different. Although I agree 100% with that, that's not playing well with a lot of people. And they cite, though, in a second article from the Washington Post, they cite a particularly, as they call it, an egregious example of why relying on these tests is such a flawed way of doing business. And there's one particular test that was published by Pearson, and it was administered in New York State as part of a language comprehension assessment. And it took Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare and replaced the tortoise with a talking pineapple. And not surprisingly, many students were confused by it, had trouble interpreting what it meant, and a whole lot of adults who looked at it later on said, yeah, this isn't just abstract thinking, this doesn't even make sense. This is nonsense and it's stupid. And yet, these are the sorts of tests on which we are relying to determine graduation, determine placement, and ultimately to really drive curriculum and drive the way that we teach our students. And so, to take that approach, this is why it's kind of been held up as a major issue. When we have such a poor agreement and tests coming out of major publishers that we know have flaws. We know these tests have flaws in terms of the way they address cultural differences, English language learners, people who have disabilities, and yet we're relying on them to determine merit pay potentially for teachers, whether or not teachers can advance on their contracts, whether or not students can advance from grade to grade, and then assigning funding to schools as well. Teachers or parents use these bits of data to determine what school districts they live in. So this is, again, time for a rethink, time for a fresh start, time for, as the New York principals call it, a wrecking ball. I don't know if it'll happen. It's met with plenty of resistance, but definitely something that we need to give some thought to. And here we go again with another wrecking ball, looking at an article from the Huffington Post on the Philadelphia public schools. They're preparing now for complete reorganization, closing of 64 schools, and potentially dissolving the district, and looking at either a state takeover or some other sort of model for delivering education in Philadelphia. Now, the closing of 64 schools in a district with hundreds of schools is not necessarily a terrible cost-cutting measure. In fact, the student population, if the student population shrinks, you need to adjust for that. That being said, though, obviously when you have a lot of struggling inner-city students, increasing class sizes is not usually the best solution. They are, however, looking at a different model. So this wrecking ball idea again, they are looking at creating what are called achievement networks. And although it's just sort of jargon, what they're really looking at is creating networks of 20 to 30 schools each that are connected either by geography or a common approach to teaching, almost like a charter district. So whereas charter schools will take a particular approach and will advance that and take that across their curriculum and have so kind of their own ability to manage that, they're looking to do the same thing with networks of schools. Actually makes a lot of sense, helping develop PLNs for teachers and expand those beyond just the sort of the echo chamber of a particular school, and allowing the pooling of resources. But the question remains, can this successfully happen, not only just in a really quite massive change for teachers and in pretty entrenched culture, but can it also be effective in a district that has funding issues, and can it be effective when we're obviously going to be increasing class sizes? Can we still do that and then look at a new model and see if that model works? In basic scientific research, you only vary one factor, one variable, and see what happens, because you can't control for everything else. When we start making a whole bunch of changes, then it becomes very, very difficult to determine what works and what doesn't, and why one thing might have worked and one might not have. So keep an eye on Philadelphia and see what happens. So one final story out of the Trinity Episcopal School. This is a story in the Charlotte Observer. And we have students who this has been done before. It's been on YouTube, but students create and teachers create interactive whiteboards out of Wiimotes, the remote controls used for Nintendo Wii. And although this isn't anything particularly new, what is pretty cool is that you had a couple of students who watched a YouTube video on this and said, we can't afford in our school Promethean or smart boards, and they call them Prometheum boards in the article, but that's okay. So we can't afford this. So you know what? Let's give our teachers what they need in terms of interactive whiteboard and do some sort of basic stuff. And they went to Radio Shack and bought $6 worth of electronics, and they put together interactive whiteboards for their school. As they say, it has 85% of the functionality for 5% of the price. And it is time for our students, our teachers, and our districts and our schools to get creative and figure out ways to make use of consumer technologies, bring your own devices, whatever it takes to get technology in the right places and use it well. Make use of these resources without, in fact, having to be bogged down in the necessary cost of acquiring technology. So let's say we can avoid spending money on technology, but there are ways to save some costs. So good news out of the Trinity Episcopal School. So that does it for this week in K12, and we'll be joined later for segments on Tool of the Week. We'll be looking at Blogs of the Week and talking more about the state of K12 educational technology. Thanks for joining us.